it is my pleasure to introduce you to Dr. Jennifer Frey. Dr. Frey is currently an assistant professor in the philosophy department at the University of South Carolina. Prior to her appointment there, Dr. Frey served as a collegiate assistant professor of humanities at the University of Chicago, where she was a member of the Society of Fellows in the Liberal Arts and also an affiliated faculty in the philosophy department. She earned her Ph.D. in philosophy at the University of Pittsburgh and a BA in both philosophy and medieval studies with a minor in classics at Indiana University at Bloomington. Dr. Frey has co-edited the book Self-Transcendence and Virtue and has published numerous pieces on virtue ethics, philosophy of action, metaethics, and the history of philosophy. Her research has been influenced most profoundly by the philosophy of, as she calls, the three A's, Aristotle, Aquinas, and Anscombe. Dr. Frey also writes for the Virtue blog and hosts a popular philosophy and literature podcast called Sacred and Profane Love. In addition to this, and perhaps most importantly, she is a wife and a mother of 6 children. Tonight, Dr. Frey will be speaking to us about Elizabeth Anscombe's Contraception and Chastity. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Jenn Frey.
Hey, everybody. So I am holed upstairs in my daughter's bedroom because it's the only quiet part of the house, and I don't have a podium. You would laugh if you saw my little setup here. So the thing that I'm most nervous about is keeping my paper in front of me without obscuring the camera and without it falling off of my laptop. So I apologize if my eye contact isn't awesome. I'm trying. We'll see how it goes. But basically, well, first of all, thanks to Love and Fidelity Network for inviting me to do this. Even though I can't see you, I'm really excited to be able to talk to some students about my hero, Elizabeth Anscombe, who both philosophically and in life has been a huge inspiration to me personally. The thing about Anscombe, I mean, I teach Anscombe all the time, is that she's really hard. So I am going to start off by telling you about who she was, because I think that's really important. And then I'm going to move into talking about her essay. It was from 1974, Contraception and Chastity. It's included in a volume titled Faith on a Hard Ground, Essays on Religion, Philosophy, and Ethics, in a series edited by my friend and colleague, John Haldane. So I'll talk to you about some of the arguments in that essay, but I'm going to contextualize those arguments by relating them to the Catholic intellectual tradition out of which they're coming. So the thought of Thomas Aquinas in particular, but I'm also going to contextualize her arguments against the backdrop of Humanae Vitae. Humanae Vitae is the encyclical that reaffirmed the ban on contraception. It was obviously very controversial. Okay, so I'm just gonna go ahead and start reading my paper. Gertrude Elizabeth Margaret Anscombe was born on March 18th, 1919 in Limerick, Ireland, where her father, a British Army officer, was stationed. Although she was raised in a religiously indifferent household, her dad was an atheist, her mom was a nominal Anglican. In high school, she decided to convert to Roman Catholicism because, by her own testimony, she believed the teachings of Christ, including most especially his teaching that the bread and wine at the Last Supper had become his body and blood, soul and divinity. In fact, when her distraught parents took her to an Anglican priest in the hope that he would talk some sense into her, she confronted him about whether what he called the body of Christ was still in fact bread. After this encounter, the priest wrote to her parents advising them to let her convert, since he had really never met anyone so convinced of the truth of the doctrine of transubstantiation. In 1937, Anscombe entered Oxford, where she studied mods and greats at St. Hugh's College. During her first year at Oxford, Anscombe studied Aquinas with the Dominicans at Blackfriars Hall, and she was formally received into the Catholic Church. In 1938, Anscombe met another philosopher and convert, Peter Geach, at a Corpus Christi procession at Blackfriars. They married in 1941 after she finished her degree. The following year, she was awarded a research fellowship at Newnham College, Cambridge, where she stayed until 1945. It was during this time that she met and attended the lectures of the world-renowned analytic philosopher Ludwig Wittgenstein. After Cambridge, she took up a faculty appointment at Somerville College in Oxford, alongside such luminaries as Iris Murdoch, Philippa Foot, and Mary Midgley. Despite being appointed at Oxford, Anscombe made weekly trips back to Cambridge to meet with Wittgenstein, who became her close friend and philosophical interlocutor. Although Wittgenstein was well known, in fact, for having a low regard for women, he was deeply impressed by, admired, and trusted Elizabeth Anscombe. He affectionately addressed her as old man. His trust in her own philosophical acumen was so deep that he appointed her his literary executor and charged her with the task of translating his most important philosophical work, even though she did not know any German. So he arranged for her to go to Vienna to learn German in order to translate it. Anscombe's translation of Wittgenstein's philosophical investigations has become a modern classic. This achievement alone would have secured her place in 20th century thought, but it was merely the beginning of her long and storied academic career. In 1970, Anscombe was appointed to the prestigious chair Wittgenstein held at Cambridge, a position that she maintained until her retirement from teaching in 1986. She also held visiting appointments all over the world. Anscombe's philosophical achievements are widely recognized. She made significant contributions in every major area of philosophy: ethics, action, language, mind, metaphysics, and logic. She also wrote many philosophical essays on a wide range of topics related to Catholic teaching. Her only monograph, Intention, has been described as the most important treatment of action since Aristotle and one of the masterworks of 20th century philosophy in English. Her essay, Modern Moral Philosophy, is still widely acknowledged as one of the most influential works of 20th century philosophy. It sparked a renewed and sustained interest in the concepts of practical reason, virtue, and human nature, concepts that are central to Catholic moral teaching, yet which had been neglected by modern moral philosophers for centuries. Anscombe's final lecture was titled Doing the Truth, and her final publication was titled Practical Truth. I think there's something fitting about this because Anscombe's life was marked not only by a well-trained desire to know reality, but also the will to conform her actions to it. That is to say, to put her entire person in the service of truth. Throughout her life, she refused to make truth subservient to practical ends, and she had very little patience for those who evinced moral earnestness when this was detached from the truth. Although Anscombe lived an intellectual life, she did not shy away from political concerns. In 1939, as an undergraduate at Oxford, Anscombe published a pamphlet protesting British rhetoric leading up to its involvement in World War II. The pamphlet was titled The Justice of the Present War Examined. The pamphlet denounced the British government's rhetoric regarding the so-called indivisibility of modern warfare because it recognized no principal distinction between civilians and enemy combatants. In this pamphlet, she argues on just war grounds that we must maintain the distinction between innocence and non-innocence within war, because without this distinction, we can no longer hold fast to the absolute or exceptionless prohibition against the killing of innocents. That is, the absolute prohibition against murder. 7 years later, as a faculty member, Anscombe opposed Oxford's move to award US President Harry S. Truman an honorary degree. Speaking on the floor of convocation to her colleagues, she argued that Truman, as the man responsible for the decision to drop atomic bombs on the Japanese cities of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, was a mass murderer. Anscombe's arguments were summarily dismissed. Only 3 of her colleagues supported her vote. Sorry, that's my paper. In 1957, Anscombe would publish another pamphlet, this one titled Mr. Truman's Degree, in which she would lay out her arguments against Truman in more detail. Her argument that Truman is unworthy of honors rests on her analysis of what we must say he intended as a means to his end in giving the order to drop weapons of mass destruction on civilian populations. In the bombing of these cities, Anscombe argues, it was certainly decided to kill the innocent as a means to an end. And this is always a description of murder. Anscombe accepts that the actions ordered by Truman saved a considerable number of lives and ended the war more quickly. But this does not matter, she argues, because Christian teaching is that we may never do evil, that good may come. Anscombe wondered why so many Oxford dons would be happy to flatter a mass murderer. She thinks the following consideration sheds some light on the subject. All the prevailing moral philosophies put forward at Oxford since the turn of the century all reject the idea that any actions, such as murder, adultery, or the judicial condemnation of the innocent, are absolutely forbidden. In her famous essay, Modern Moral Philosophy, Anscombe argues that it is the shared commitment to what she calls consequentialism that explains this fact. Now, as Anscombe defines it, a moral philosophy is consequentialist if it denies the importance of the distinction between intention and foresight. According to the consequentialist, it does not make any difference to a man's responsibility for an effect of his action which he can foresee, but he does not intend it. And if there is no such difference, Anscombe argues, then all one can do is weigh up the consequences of one's actions and choose that action which will bring about the best results. Absolute prohibitions would obviously no longer make any sense. And the arguments in defense of Truman's actions were all obviously consequentialist, as Anscombe notes. In her work, Anscombe attacks consequentialism on philosophical grounds, but she is also quick to note that it is radically out of joint with Judeo-Christian ethics. And one of her most significant philosophical contributions is intention, in which she argues for a radically non-consequentialist account of action and practical reason. Now, as you know, Anscombe wrote several philosophical essays in defense of Catholic teaching on the nature and purpose of human sexuality, right at the time that the world began to vociferously denounce it. Her commitments to church teaching were not merely intellectual. Anscombe was the mother of 7 children, all of whom remained committed Catholics as adults. Anscombe's defense of Catholic sexual ethics certainly put her on the outs with the dons at Oxford and made her into the subject of attack. In a scathing critique of her writings on chastity, the philosopher Bernard Williams accused her of preaching impoverishment of life, to which she replied the following, and this is a quote. "This is an honest accusation. It is something they really think about what I really think. It is an old and intelligible accusation against the Christian religion, that one must be prepared to lose one's life to save it, that being poor in spirit is blessed, that what looks like deprivation and mutilation may in fact be the path of life, the alternative death. All this Christianity has indeed taught. It is strange that ordinary chaste and faithful marriage should seem to exemplify this, but that is what our age is like." Anscombe was sometimes at odds with her fellow Christians as well. In a famous debate with C.S. Lewis, Anscombe destroyed one of his central arguments for theism. While some were dismayed that she would so ardently oppose an argument for the existence of God, Anscombe simply saw herself as fulfilling a duty to expose poor reasoning. She was certain, on Thomistic principles, that the truths of the faith will never contradict or oppose right reasoning. They will merely perfect it in light of its own natural limitations. Mary Geach, Anscombe's daughter, relates an interesting story about her mother's faithful reason. As an undergraduate, Elizabeth Anscombe encountered a passage in Bertrand Russell's writings in which he argued that an argument from facts about the world to the existence of God could not be valid, as one could never deduce a necessary conclusion from merely contingent premises. She had not at the time been able to see what was wrong with this claim, but she knew that it went against Catholic doctrine, so she went to the church to make an act of faith. "My God, I believe in thee, and all thy church doth teach, because thou hast said it, and thy word is true." After careful reflection, she did come to see that Russell was wrong, and that she could demonstrate this philosophically. But it was only on account of her faith that she was led to pursue the matter, to find the reason why. Without her faith, she probably would have taken Russell, the great philosopher and logician, at his word. Her faith very often guided where she directed her attention in philosophy. In 1986, she composed her own Syllabus of Errors, in which she argued that many of the beliefs put forward by prominent analytic philosophies were, quote, inimical to the Christian religion, such as, and these are the inimical beliefs, that a human being is not necessarily a person, that we are not members of a biological species, but merely rational selves, or that there are no natural kinds or essences. Now, if you look at her corpus as a whole, you find that she is attacking these very theses on strictly philosophical grounds with arguments that any non-believer might reasonably accept. But she's doing so because she believes that they are against the faith. In addition to facing open contempt and scorn from her contemporaries, Anscombe was willing to be arrested for her convictions, and she was not averse to public protest. She was arrested twice at abortion clinics in her advanced age. Although her conservative fans tend to downplay her public opposition to World War II, Truman, the Vietnam War, and nuclear arms, her progressive fans are equally embarrassed by her commitments to the inviolable dignity or worth of each human person at every stage of human life, and her conviction of the traditional ideals of chastity. Certainly, it would be very difficult to characterize her in terms of our contemporary political categories, precisely because her thought and reasoning simply did not bend themselves to conform to the goals of any political party or agenda. She was committed to the truth. Finally, although Anscombe was a devout and committed Catholic, many of her friends and closest collaborators, as well as the majority of her students, were not. They disagreed with her about matters of grave ethical import, including her views about human sexuality. What allowed Anscombe to enter into these relationships was her desire to understand, which led her into deep friendships with others who shared it. And what her students and friends admired in her and were attracted to in her, it seems, was not merely her manifest brilliance, but also her dogged and unflinching insistence upon the truth, no matter how inconvenient or unpopular it might be. For Anscombe, the pursuit of the truth involved engagement with error, and thus it is a mistake to surround oneself with people who happen to agree with you. Wittgenstein had taught Anscombe that you cannot go too carefully about a philosophical error. You do not know how much truth there may be in it. And Anscombe was often able to extract the kernel of truth from false philosophical views. Her essays often begin, in the manner of the great scholastic theologians, by considering the value of the position that she will ultimately reject. In this, she aimed to do philosophy as Wittgenstein, her teacher, had taught her, the bloody hard way. And finally, I'm going to conclude this little bit on her life by noting that Anscombe certainly did not accept the conventional gender norms placed on Catholic women in her day. She was averse to dresses and preferred pants, going so far as to remove her pants when told that women could not wear them to a restaurant she had been taken to by her academic hosts. This is a true story that her daughter has confirmed to me personally. She did not take her husband's name. She did not stay at home with the children, and she was content to leave them in the care of others. She was definitely not known for being nice or deferential or well-kept, and she did not maintain a decorous home. And yet she took on the roles of her gender that she thought were not superficial, but important and deep. She was a faithful wife and a mother. She cooked, she managed hospitality to others. She took the education of her children very seriously, most especially their education in the faith. She did not identify as a feminist, nor can one find feminist principles in her philosophy. Whatever she made of the equality of the sexes, it could not for her come at the price of the truths of morality and what she took to be the unique responsibilities of womanhood, which she bore without complaint or fanfare. So that's my little bit on Elizabeth Anscombe. And now I just am going to move into talking about contraception and sex. So First, I just want to talk about happiness and virtue and practical reason, because that's kind of the most general framework that she's working with. This is going to be a lot of stuff from modern moral philosophy, but contextualized through Humanae Vitae. Okay, so Anscombe accepts an account of practical reason as aimed at a single end, happiness or human perfection, or maybe we could just say human flourishing. Now, the Church's teachings on human sexuality are in fact about happiness, even though they are often posed in an entirely negative way. But basically, when a specific church teaching says, you have to do X or you can never do Y, what is being said is that doing X will help you grow in a specific virtue, a virtue that is constitutive of a well-ordered life or perfective of your nature as a human person, whereas doing Y promotes the development of a specific vice that is constitutive of a disordered life, because it contributes to an abuse or neglect of one's inherent potential to attain human happiness. So if it's prohibited, it's because it cuts against your own good, your own happiness. Now, when we're talking about happiness, we're talking about virtue, since virtue is what allows us to be happy. My own view is that we should stop talking about Humanae Vitae as the encyclical that bans contraception. It would be better to say that it is a teaching about what constitutes happiness for those who are called to married life. The encyclical contains 4 essential but contentious claims. The first, and probably most contentious, is that contraceptive sex is a malum in se. It's intrinsically evil. Why? Because it is an act that opposes the virtue of chastity and promotes the vice of lust. 2, it is an act that violates chastity because the intrinsic nature and meaning of the marital act is generative or life-giving, and so inherently ordered to the good of bearing and rearing children and to promoting the kind of indissoluble bond that is necessary to share completely in that good together. Spousal love is essentially ordained to this good. This is what distinguishes it from other forms of intimate friendship that are also part of a good human life. 3, contraceptive intercourse intentionally destroys the act's life-giving nature, thereby making it into another kind of act altogether, different from the marital act. Contraceptive intercourse is an act that is constitutively ordered to the gratification of one's desire for sexual pleasure. And 4th, and finally, the virtue of chastity is necessary for human happiness. Neither man nor woman can be truly happy without it, whether married, single, or celibate. The vice of lust impedes or opposes human happiness. We must emphasize, too, that happiness in the Church's moral tradition is a common good, and that the cultivation of forms of unchastity leads to social harms. So as a part of temperance, chastity is related to justice in important respects. And I think in a contemporary vein, we can think about sex abuse and sexual harassment, sexual objectification and exploitation as confirmation of this essential connection between personal chastity or lack thereof and justice or injustice. Okay, so those are the 4 contentious claims. Now I just want to back up a little bit and say something about virtue, just very generally. So virtue is a disposition that perfects a natural power or capacity in a human person by making its exercise good. The concept of virtue is something that makes no sense unless we are talking about powers or potentialities and the ends and goods to which they're ordered. This is the background context of the claim that virtue is a disposition to act in ways that characteristically lead to human happiness. Okay, sorry, my voice is starting to go. Now, we are not born with these dispositions in the way that we're born with, say, the ability to see or hear. The virtues involve a special kind of rational training, a kind of Bildung or a moral education, and it's the special job of parents as the primary educators of their children to see to it that something like the virtues are instilled in them. The development of virtue takes time because a human being must come to see that certain ways of acting are not only good, but also must come to enjoy those very ways of acting. In this way, virtue becomes second nature to someone because they become the kind of person that is inclined to virtuous action and enjoys performing them. In this way, virtue resembles skill. So just as the person who possesses the skill of grammar becomes such as to speak and write grammatically whenever the occasion arises, so too the virtuous person stands ready to perform the kinds of actions that constitute a good human life on the whole. And like the possession of a practical skill, there's really no way to become virtuous except by repeatedly acting in a way that a virtuous person does, which you can only do by imitating someone that you think is virtuous. And that means to come to do the right thing for the right reason in the right circumstances. Now, chastity specifically is a moral virtue. It's a disposition that regulates the powers of the soul that are not themselves essentially rational, so like the lower appetites. These powers are capable of being brought under the control of reason, so we can align their exercise with our general conception of how to live, but they are not themselves essentially rational in the way that like judgment or choice is essentially rational. So the scholastic philosophers and theologians called these the irascible and concupiscible appetites, and they identified them with our passions, but I'm just going to refer to them as sensual appetites, right? I think that's a little bit more in line with contemporary ways of talking. Now, I think we all know more or less from experience that our emotions or our lower appetites can be recalcitrant in the face of our judgments about what it is best to do. You can be incredibly angry with someone, even when you know that you ought to forgive them or be merciful towards them. You can be afraid to fly, even though you know that it's far safer than other common forms of transportation. You can be sexually attracted to someone and even become sexually aroused, even though you know that the attraction is bad and not well ordered. And even when you recognize that acting on this kind of desire is likely to create a great deal of strife and harm, right? So there can be this disconnect between reason and emotion. Our emotions, we like to say, kind of have a life of their own. And we all know the havoc that is created when we allow our emotions and our appetites to be out of control. Sorry, I just accidentally covered myself. Perils of not having a podium. Okay, so for this reason, right, that your lower appetites are not essentially rational. For this reason, the church has always acknowledged the need for moral virtue and not simply prudence. So right practical judgment doesn't suffice. For what good is practical judgment if our emotions and appetites are leading us now this way, now that way, like leaves being blown about in the wind? Moreover, how can we expect to have right practical judgment if our emotions are disordered? Again, experience teaches us that when we are inordinately angry or sad or scared or aroused, our judgment is often quite terrible. Our emotions impair our capacity to judge correctly. This is not to say that a good human life is one that is free from our emotions. Rather, it is to say that a good human life is a life of perfected emotion and appetite. It is the life in which our emotions express the order of reason. This happens through the acquisition of moral virtue over time, right? And it takes time and a certain kind of training and discipline. And chastity is the virtue that allows the order of reason to be developed in our sexual powers and appetites. And as such, it is a moral virtue rather than an intellectual virtue. So this isn't a virtue that perfects your judgments, but your ability to experience certain kinds of desires. More specifically, chastity is a species of temperance, and that is one of the cardinal virtues. Temperance concerns goods that are discerned by our sense of touch, such as the pleasures of eating, drink, and sex. These concern real human goods and real human pleasures. It's important to stress that there is no whiff of horror at these natural desires and pleasures, either in the teachings of Humanae Vitae or in the teachings of Anscombe or Aquinas. So there's no attempt to disown or say that these pleasures are inherently bad. Sexual desire and sexual pleasure is a necessary part of chaste married life. We do well to remember, I think, that St. Thomas, the great doctor of the church, taught that complete aversion to all sexual pleasure is not only an imperfection, but a moral defect. So the church is not puritanical. She's a friend of pleasure. Chastity is the virtue that realizes the order of reason in our sexual powers. Lust, by contrast, is the transgression and violation of the rational order in the sphere of human life. So this brings me to my final point about the virtues, and that is that they necessarily form a unity. So if you think about adultery, I think this clearly shows that temperance is connected to justice. So if I cheat on my spouse out of lust, I have wronged my spouse, certainly, but also my children and my community, because adultery destabilizes the bonds of the family and thereby destabilizes the political order. Unchastity is the root cause of much practical blindness. Lust can split the power of decision. It prevents one from being in full possession of oneself and consists in giving oneself over to reckless abandonment of what one knows is generally good. It can cripple our capacity to see what is truly and objectively good, including what we owe to others. In that sense, lust is always an unfortunate constriction of the space of value, rather than an expansion of it. It's a kind of turning onto oneself in the most negative sense. I think we all recognize that excessive drink can color our right judgments about what is good, and I really don't understand why we deny that excessive sexual desire has the exact same effect. I think it does. Thus, it is wrong to say that sexual morality is simply a matter of one's private life and of no concern to anyone else. The opposite is true, precisely because chastity is the preserver of justice. The unchaste man will be tempted to injustice in ways that the chaste man will not. So it's nonsense to say that we should only concern ourselves with justice and not chastity. If we are concerned with one, we are necessarily concerned with the other. Now, the church teaches, and Anscombe affirms, that the natural law requires virtue, and that contraception is against the natural law. But what does this mean? So I think it's often wrongly assumed that the opposition to contraception is that it is artificial. Nothing could be further from the case. We must not lose sight of the fact that acts such as defrauding workers of a just wage, stealing, and gossip are just as much against the natural law as contraception. We need to be clear that the invocation of the natural law is simply one of the ways of speaking intelligently about the good life for the human person. What is natural about the natural law is that man is by nature a rational animal. And the natural law contains what a human person can know about his or her own happiness without the aid of revelation, that is to say, solely through the correct use of natural reason. Furthermore, contrasting artificial with so-called natural methods of birth control is really unconvincing and confused. So if you know anything about natural family planning, then you know that most natural methods of birth control involves lots of technical apparatus, use of expensive, complicated thermometers, apps on your cell phone, monitoring hormone levels, etc. So again, the problem is not that contraception involves techne, because natural family planning involves techne. The problem is that it is against right reason. And so we need to be able to be clear about why this is the case. Okay. Contraception is a malum in se. It's intrinsically evil or bad. For that reason, it is absolutely prohibited. Anscombe, following Aristotle and Aquinas, argued that human actions such as murder, rape, apostasy, adultery, and contraception are absolutely ruled out, just in virtue of being described as such and such actions, because under such descriptions, they pick out human actions that are incompatible with virtue and happiness. And this is the case regardless of whatever good consequences they might bring about in any particular circumstances. So absolute prohibitions function as kind of first principles in her theory of practical reason. And this would be something that, again, she's picking up from both Aristotle and Aquinas. So how do they function? They stop deliberation, right? Precisely because one has a kind of moral perception that one never has a reason to perform these actions, regardless of the circumstances. So basically, if you are if you're a right practical reasoner, if you're good at practical deliberation, then you're just never going to go there. So what it means for it to function as a first principle is just to say that that there's that no matter what the thing to do is in this situation, it's not going to be to murder someone. That's not going to be the solution. And so then you're going to search for something else. First principles rest on self-evident perceptions. And I will return to that point later in the lecture. Now, Anscombe argues in this paper that contraception is wrong because it is a, quote, grave breach of chastity, just as murder is a grave breach of justice. It is against chastity in virtue of its intention. So, what is the intention of the contracepting actor? The intention, she argues, is to use some means to render the marital or sexual act infertile. This, Anscombe argues, turns it into a different sort of act altogether. So it goes from being a reproductive act to being a pleasure-seeking act. Though both involve sexual desire, when a married couple performs the marital act, it is the work of reasonable minds. Whereas when a married couple engages in contraceptive intercourse, they do not perform the marital act at all, Anscombe argues, and it is simply appetite that is in control, since what is sought is not the good of the marital act, which is children, but merely the satisfaction of the sexual appetites apart from the goods to which they are properly ordered. This makes the marital act on a par with what tradition calls unnatural sex acts. What makes them unnatural? They are intrinsically unfit for generation. Acts which Aquinas argues are actually worse, morally worse than fornication and adultery. Those acts are wrong, but they're merely rendered wrong by their undue circumstances rather than the nature of the act itself. Okay, so in order to make this case, Anscombe draws upon one of the central distinctions that she makes in her really famous book, Intention, and that is between performing an act intentionally or on purpose or for reasons, and performing an intentional action for the sake of some further intention or end in mind. So she argues that in contraceptive intercourse, you intend to perform a sexual act which, if it has a chance of being fertile, you intentionally render infertile. Qua your intentional action, then, what you do is something intrinsically unapt for generation, and that is why it falls under the condemnation of unnatural sex acts, which has the exact same status. By contrast, refraining from sex during the times one knows one is generally fertile is an ordinary marriage act. Right? So if you wait to have sex when you know that you're infertile, she thinks that's an ordinary marriage act. But if you intentionally make a sex act infertile through some specific means, then it's a contraceptive act. And her main claim is these are different kinds of acts. One is licit and the other is not. Now, here an obvious objection, an objection that maybe you've heard many times, is this. How is contraceptive intercourse fundamentally different from sex during infertile times? How can we say that having sex with a condom or having sex while undergoing a regime of artificial hormones is fundamentally different from having sex only when one knows that one is past the time in which the wife's reproductive cycle, only past the time in which the wife's reproductive cycle is at a place where an egg can actually be fertilized? Like, how is this any different? Because in each case, right, The couple knows that having sex in these circumstances means that a new life will most likely not be conceived. And in both cases, the intention is identical. Both couples want explicitly to avoid conception, right? That's what's guiding why they wait. And that's what's guiding why they use a condom or take a hormonal contraceptive pill. Okay, so Anscombe makes an interesting move here. So she draws an analogy. So she wants to change. The situation. So she kind of wants to pump your intuitions. So she draws an analogy here between working to rule versus sabotage, right? So she imagines a laborer who seeks to get a higher wage, and this person wants to pressure his boss by working to rule, which is to say to do his job, but basically only at the contractual minimum, right? So it's significantly lower than normal productivity, but it's still like productivity. And it's like the least you can do and not break your contract. And then she contrasts that with sabotage. Sabotaging one's work is intentionally making the work unproductive in itself, say by intentionally breaking the machine so that the work will not produce the usual results. Both acts are done for the same good end, that is to say, to put pressure on the bosses to increase the pay to a just wage. But, she notes, these are different acts in service of the same goal. In exactly the same way that sex during infertile times and contraceptive acts are different sorts of acts, though they're often undertaken for the sake of the same goal, which is not to conceive. Working to rule, Anscombe notes, is still doing one's job, though with the intention to lower productivity. Sabotage is not doing one's job at all. It is doing something intentionally to undermine that job. Similarly, sex during an infertile period is still the reproductive act of the human species and the marital act, whereas, she argues, contraceptive sex is not a reproductive act at all. It's merely a pleasure-seeking act. So here's another way to put the same point. The marital act, when performed in the normal way, that is to say, without having taken some external means towards rendering it infertile, is essentially ordained to the good of new human life and the good of marriage itself. This is no less true when a woman is in a later stage in her monthly cycle. Even when engaged in during ovulation, not all essentially generative acts produce children. In fact, most of them do not. The overwhelming majority of them do not. So when a couple performs a true marital act, what they do together with their bodies is ordained to procreation, whether the child is conceived or not. And this is especially going to be true for infertile couples, people who are infertile naturally and not by some external means. By contrast, when a couple does, when they use a condom or take a contraceptive pill, is intentionally render an essentially generative act non-generative. Again, in order to make sense of this, we have to distinguish between the inherent nature of the intentional act and the further intentions with which that act is performed. Murder is always wrong, even when it's performed for good intentions. Truman, for example, had really good intentions in dropping the atomic bombs. He wanted to end the war and he wanted to save lives. Still, he intentionally murdered innocent Japanese as a means to this end. And in so doing, he violated the Pauline principle that we may never do evil, that good may come. And it's the same thing with contraceptive sex. You know, sometimes it can be licit to not want to conceive, but you cannot intentionally do a prohibited act in order to attain that end. And the church, in fact, teaches that it's not bad to want to delay children when one has a proportionate reason to do so. So what's wrong with contraceptive intercourse is not the intention to avoid children. The church acknowledges that this intention is sometimes licit. So like if the mother's life is at risk or more children are not financially sustainable or in accordance with the common good of the family. What is wrong with contraception is that what is done intentionally as a means to this end of avoiding conception is an act of lust, which an act of lust always opposes the virtue of chastity. Lust is inordinate pursuit of sexual pleasures, those unbound by the proper goods of reason. Human nature and the given facts of human reproduction set the parameters of these norms. Natural family planning demands that a married couple abstain from sex during the woman's window of fertility, which involves delaying gratification and exercising rational self-control. Such actions promote chastity, which is only acquired and maintained by disciplining, that is to say, curbing and restraining one's sexual appetites. When couples routinely practice such self-denial for the sake of the good of their marriage, sorry, I gotta turn the page, they demonstrate that they are not slaves to their appetites, that they can, in fact, rationally order their appetites and their actions to the common goods of the family and their married life together. A husband who abstains from sex with his wife for the sake of her bodily health respects her. He recognizes that her good is more important than the goods of his own sexual pleasures, and he demonstrates to her that he is able to wait until she can engage in the marriage act in a safe and responsible manner. If he asks her to make herself infertile, then he is asking her to be on demand for him whenever he needs and wants her. This is to treat his wife as a means to his own ends, and I think it's pretty selfish. Anscombe argues that the virtue of chastity is a supra-utilitarian virtue because it involves a mystical perception of the mystery of human sexuality and purity of heart. She argues that those who try to say that sex is mere casual enjoyment pay the penalty. They become shallow people. Such people dishonor their own bodies. Although she does not use these terms here, I think Anscombe is talking about the virtue of piety, about the need to stand in awe and appreciation of the deep mysteries of human life. So it's like the stuff of piety is birth, sex, and death. We see that throwing a corpse in the trash heap is dishonorable and wrong. This perception is both mystical and ordinary and common in human life. Anscombe compares it to the perception of the sanctity and value of human life generally. The absolute prohibition against murder is ultimately grounded in this perception. The murderer or the suicide fails to have reverence for that which is properly reverence-worthy. The same is true of the man or woman who uses contraception. They have a lack of reverence for purity. I will close by attending to another common objection to church teaching, and that is this. Why is the marital act the generative act? Why does the church privilege one kind of sexual act and consider it the gold standard of spousal intercourse? This isn't really something that Anscombe considers, and so that's why I want to end by considering it. I mean, look, we all know that the so-called marital act is hardly the only option for lovers to express their affection and desire for one another. And it's not even the most obviously pleasurable sexual act you could engage in. Perhaps this whole idea of the marital act is patriarchal and heteronormative and it ought to be dispensed with. I mean, definitely in my world, that's the obvious reaction to this claim. This is another common response to Humanae Vitae, and I think we need to have a compelling answer to this. So here's one way to do this. I think we need to pose the question, what is the difference actually between marriage and other forms of friendship? We do not think much about this question, but we should. We should ask ourselves why marital intimacy and bonds be given priority in our lives. What is so special about married love? I don't think it can really be the question of bodily pleasure. So my other forms of friendship involve bodily touch and bodily pleasures. Here are some act types I perform with some of my close friends. Kisses, hugs, tousling of hair, rubbing of back and shoulders, squeezing hands, etc. These are just some of the many ways that we express affection for friends, both men and women, especially in Europe. There's a lot of kissing. There are 1,000 more. I also engage in many incredibly pleasurable activities with my friends, preparing and eating meals together, watching and discussing films, having intellectual conversations that go well into the night, enjoying drinks together, etc. But in doing any of these things, I am not giving my friends my entire self. I'm not allowing them to enter into the most intimate sphere of my body and my person. Why not? I'm very close with some of my friends, some of whom are pretty attractive. So why shouldn't we exchange sexual pleasures? Why can't that be one more thing that we do together that helps to develop our friendship? Like, why not? This question is harder to answer than you'd think. And it's one of the many reasons that people sleep with their friends now and turn to polyamorous relationships more generally. What I would like to suggest is that if there is any legitimate answer to this question, it is this: the purpose and meaning of a human person's intimate sex organs, so like their inherent meaning and value, it just closes off the possibility of making them available even to the closest of my friends or anyone else other than my spouse. This is the difference between real marriages and other forms of intimate friendships that the reality of contraceptive marriage obscures, to the detriment of both non-sexual friendships and marriage. In the marital act, I achieve a comprehensive bodily unity with my spouse that I do not seek to achieve with my friends. Why not? Precisely because the ends of that act, conceiving and raising children, are not ends that I seek with my friends, no matter how much I love them, and no matter how much I enjoy sharing parts of my life with them. Contracepting couples, on the other hand, engage in an act that, for all that it means, they might as well do with their close friends. If it's just about showing love through the mutual giving and receiving of sensual pleasures, it is unclear why you cannot share that with your friends, or more than one person generally. But the life-giving or the generative act, on the other hand, demands fidelity and monogamy and permanence. It demands this for the child as well as for society. The meaning of marriage goes well beyond the hearts and minds of the spouses, precisely because the marital act is generative. It involves the reproduction of the human species and therefore of society itself. Okay, that's my argument. I'm done.